Thank you so much, and thank you for that very kind introduction. And I certainly hope and look forward to the time when we will all be together in person. And I'm grateful for this panel and the caliber and the expertise of these individuals to have this conversation, particularly given in the political time that we are in right now with the geopolitical environment. And I know everybody is joining from different time zones, and certainly look forward to this discussion. As you just heard from the director of our agency, Jen Easterly, at CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency in the United States, we're dedicated to building a culture of resilience to strengthen our digital infrastructure in the long run. And as part of this global community, one of the efforts that I'm particularly interested in as we focus on looking at how CISA can engage collaboratively across the global environment, I'm interested in this conversation as we look to really build out cyber resilience, global cyber resilience worldwide. As we all know, cybersecurity doesn't respect boundaries. It is something that we all have to come together to engage upon. And this panel is an incredible caliber of experts for this discussion. And without going any further, we'll jump right into the conversation. And I want to introduce the panelists. First, we have Lindy Cameron, who serves as the Chief Executive Officer for the United Kingdom's National Cybersecurity Center. Next is Benjamin Eng, who served as Senior Fellow and Head of the Cyber Program at the Center of Excellence for National Security within the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies in Singapore. And then we have Peter Sass, who serves as Deputy Director for Hungary's National Cybersecurity Center. And finally, Arne Schönbaum, who serves as President of the Federal Office for Information Security in Bonn. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. So we'll get right into the conversation. Firstly, as we look at this environment, the geopolitical environment, the active one today, we recognize it's really since the beginning of the pandemic, but it's hard to know where the lines on this really started or where the current event started. The scope and severity of cyber attacks has really been increasing. Certainly with the pandemic, we saw with the move to work from home, the interdependencies that were created and the vulnerability of the threat platform getting larger with everybody working on their own digital devices and looking at that interconnectedness. And in the past year, we've witnessed really a series of major ransomware attacks, major events on JBS, the US Colonial Pipeline, but other cyber attacks and ransomware in the context of geopolitical tensions. So I'd like to ask each of you as we start this conversation, from an agency, ministry, and country perspective, what's your assessment of the current cyber threat? But importantly, in light of your assessment, what are you focused on? What are you prioritizing in addressing it? And Lindy, I'll start with you.
Thanks very much indeed, Kirsten, and fantastic to be here and to have had a chance to hear Jen's amazing keynote. So, I think we're in a really exciting year for cybersecurity. It's important not to see this just as a set of threats, albeit the current context means we have to, but actually as a set of opportunities. The reason cybersecurity is higher up the agenda, and it's higher up a much bigger agenda, this was discussed last year at the G7, is because it's about the opportunities of technology as well as the national security threats. But I think the really great thing for me is that this now is the subject of conversation between world leaders, because this is something that is no longer seen simply as a technical set of issues. As Jen said, it's an organizational culture set of issues, and in fact, it's a geopolitical set of issues. So for me, there's a real opportunity this year to take cybersecurity out of a technical conversation and into a political and strategic conversation that says, actually, this is something for everybody. But it's not something to be scared of. It's something you can do something about. Each of you, as private citizens, as members of organizations, can actually do something to improve your own personal resilience, your organization's resilience. But actually, it's something that we really do have to take seriously, because we want people to be able to live and work safely online in our own countries and globally, and to do so confidently, I think. So for me, it's that moment of political change that is the biggest sort of turning point in cybersecurity at the moment. But I think, of course, we can't not reflect on the current crisis, where I think that this is a moment where we are certainly re-emphasizing to organizations the real importance of making sure that they are prepared, not just for the kind of cyber criminality that we see, but also for potential for state action in a way that means that they need to have built their resilience. It's not about asking them to do new things, it's about asking them to carry on doing the things they should have been doing anyway, but to do them faster and better in order to anticipate a level of uncertainty. And so I think we're taking that as a moment to kind of get people to shift their behavior and shift it faster. But I think then the third thing I just say is that it will be easy for the current geostrategic crisis to pull us onto a very tactical set of issues currently, it's really important that we don't lose sight of the trajectory of change in technology in the long term, which I think is the big trend that we need to really get ahead. And that's where I'm asking my organization to spend a lot of time thinking very imaginatively about what technology of the future will look like in a way that means we should think about what cybersecurity of the future looks like as well.
Thanks so much, Lindy. And you really captured the spectrum of what we're dealing with, which is the work on human behavior, ensuring that individuals really understand their accountability and responsibility in cybersecurity, from strong authentication to looking at, phishing and all these pieces. And I know the NCSC has led some tremendous work with small businesses, and that really is so important. And then on the other end, at that evolution is inspiring and encouraging innovation to recognize that, we've got to be able to look at this full spectrum. And I think it's so critical to see this comprehensively, and looking at cyber is truly interdisciplinary. And there's a lot that you talked about that I definitely want to follow up on, but I'll turn it over next to Benjamin. As you look at this and your assessment of the threat and what you're prioritizing, how would you lay out that sequence? Benjamin, I think you're on mute.
You'd think that after 2.5 years of this, we'd have gotten that bad. But thank you very much, Kirsten, for the question. And it's such a pleasure to be on this panel with such illustrious speakers. And thank you, Lindy, for such a positive view of the opportunities rather than just the threats, because there are a lot of threats, and the pandemic definitely hasn't helped reduce any of them. Cybercrime has really increased in the Asian region. ASEAN countries have experienced a lot of phishing, a lot of scams. And this also has been a problem because many of us have had to go online. There's been a digital divide problem in many of the ASEAN countries, where people who were not previously online had to get online very quickly, and possibly on systems that were not as secure and without the training in security to be able to keep themselves safe. So if you look at it from an opportunity point of view, this is actually the opportunity to get everybody to understand better how to give themselves better cyber hygiene, and for the whole of society to really band together to help those who are at a disadvantage to get on board, so that they can come on board and benefit from all of the benefits of digital transformation in a safe way. Because it is a problem that if people are not equipped with either with adequate technology or with adequate information, then it's very difficult for them to protect themselves. And so it's both hand in hand. As a whole of society, we've got to do that. And in the ASEAN context, other than cybercrime, of course, there is a concern that the geopolitical situation can spill over to us, because the supply chain is international, and the ASEAN countries are part of that supply chain. And we have many businesses in Singapore, whether they are Ukrainian businesses, Russian businesses, Chinese businesses, US businesses, UK businesses, who could become collateral damage and then, of course, spill over into our situation, as we learned from the WannaCry and NotPetya situations. So cautiously hopeful.
Thank you so much. And thank you for enforcing and emphasizing this cyber hygiene piece. I think, there's been this expectation that solutions rely only in technology. And so as we look at what, again, to Lindy's point, that individual responsibility, but then how do we marry that with technology and innovation to help us move to the next place? Peter, I'll ask you your thoughts on this issue and the assessment of the current threat.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So in a Hungarian perspective, and as we see in our constituency, the number and the severity of ransomware attacks are also increasing. The major threat is that there is no longer just factories or critical infrastructures, and services that are being attacked, but also healthcare facilities, which means that it is a real threat to human life. So the increase in the number and complexity of phishing attacks is also a major problem, and it's a vector for the attacks. Our tax authorities are now refunding personal income tax and it is exploited by criminal organizations for the purpose of phishing. Sometimes phishing sites are using geo-IP filtering and redirect from a foreign IP address to the real site. That's make it more difficult to convince foreign service providers to shut down the malicious websites. So as in our perspective, coordination, communication, and working together with other nations is very important to tackle these difficulties. And regarding the Russian and Ukrainian conflict, the attribution is very hard to do in such attacks and incidents. So we haven't detected any offense or offensive activity regarding these conflicts that we can surely attribute to any kind of threat actors.
Thank you so much, Peter. And Arne, as you look at these issues from the perspective of Germany, how would you assess the threat? And importantly, what are you prioritizing and how you're addressing it?
Yes, Kirsten, thank you very much. And to be very clear, I would love to see you live on stage. Even if I'm head of a national cybersecurity authority, I really would love to see you live, because I prefer to do it this way, because then we can have much more interaction on all the different kind of areas. And this is exactly what COVID-19, I think, first of all, has shown us very clearly, that we are now living much stronger in a digitized age than before. And this made it very clear also that potential attackers are having a much larger scale how to attack us. And this is something, I think, what we have seen over the last years. In October in Germany, I published the so-called annual IT security report. There we made it very clear that, for example, we see per day, more than 400,000 new variants of malware. This is compared to 2020, an increase of 22%. And the criminals and the other actors are not providing all this malware just for fun. It's not their hobby, but it's for earning money, for doing something with it. We have seen, of course, some great ransomware attacks, DDoS attacks, and so on. All this is on the rise. We saw it towards local governments. We saw it to many organizations. We saw it to hospitals, to companies. And therefore, we have stated in October last year already that in some parts that we are having a kind of red alert in the overall cyber threat landscape. For example, within Germany, we have seen, related malware infections we have sent to the so-called provider. We have doubled the notifications to the provider from 7 to 14 million. And we have, of course, increased also the malicious malware attacks to the German government from 35,000 to 44,000 per month. And for me, it is very important that the overall, as you have said, Kerstin, it is not a static situation we are looking for. It's a very dynamic situation. We see, of course, malicious actors that plan to do sabotage, which are going to use ransomware. We see it quite clearly, and I think, Lindy, you see it in the same way like we do. We see it that some conflicts outside of Europe, let's put it that way, can move towards Europe and other actors by accident. And we see, and this is something which is increasing, hackers for hire. So therefore, you don't need to have your own capability. It is very easy to purchase, to procure hackers on the darknet, on other kind of criminal areas, and they are selling their exploits and malware to international customers. So who is paying most is getting this kind of expertise. So this is something, a kind of shifting away from where you need to have your own resources to that you can just hire it, like an accountant, you can hire your hacker who is going to do the work for you. And this, of course, will become very important. And therefore, I think for me, there are 3 areas which we have to intensify. One is technologically, yes. Otherwise, it will be extremely difficult to identify the actors. Number two is international cooperation. That's why I'm so grateful that we're having this panel here. I think it is great to be here with our friends from Hungary, from Singapore, from the US, and from the UK to discuss how to move forward jointly together. We have a common goal there. And number three, that's exactly what Jean has already said. It is cyber hygiene, how to train the people, because just technology will not work, just people will not work. So it needs to be a combination out of it. That's how I see it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And as you talk and as each of you has spoken about the integration of different elements to help not only assess the threat, but how are we going to address it? One of the key elements to all of this, as we have looked at it, is how we work with industry and government. In January of this year, the UK has published a cybersecurity strategy as part of an investment in cybersecurity. In the United States, there's been greater investment in the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency on the public side. But as we know, what we often say in the US government is cyber is a team sport. This is not going to be achieved, accomplished, overcome by any one entity. And that is true, obviously, across industry and government. And the other evolution of this thinking is we've talked a lot about public-private partnerships, but how do we really operationalize that? And so one of the terms that we're using at CISA is very much about operational collaboration. And you heard Jen mention that in her address. And I think as we look at this, it's really how are industry and government working together effectively? And so I would ask each of you, how is your public sector equipped for attacks? And importantly, how are you working with industry, and are you seeing any successes or particular challenges in light of the threat, in light of what's happened over the last couple of years? And Benjamin, I'll start with you.
Thanks, Kirsten. I think that our public sector has been pretty secure, and not just from my view, but since we were ranked fourth in the ITU's Global Cybersecurity Index GCI for 2020, and there's a huge budget of $1 billion Singapore dollars, which is about US 700 million. But aside from that good news and the fact that the critical infrastructure providers are also required by law to harden their cybersecurity, one of the things that we've really been very cognizant about in Singapore is the need for the whole of the population to be secure, because it's not necessarily just the public sector or the critical infrastructure that's going to be a target. Because once these are hard, then the soft underbelly is actually the person in the street. And that's why Singapore launched the Safer Cyberspace Master Plan, which is a whole drive to get everybody, the small businesses, the medium businesses, which actually make up a huge chunk of every economy, especially the ASEAN economies, and to person in the street, to get that awareness out on cybersecurity, cyber hygiene. Just to give an example, without having to hit the banks, recently there was a large spate of phishing scams on one of the major banks, and dozens of people were cheated out of their entire life savings, and the banks had to do a huge, legally they were protected. They could have actually washed their hands out of it, but because it was such a huge thing, they had to give out goodwill reimbursements to the tunes of millions of dollars. And if you can imagine, if this had been scaled up and then combined with a cyber-enabled information operation, it could have started a panic, run on the banks, could have really affected the financial system. And for countries like us, which are very interconnected with other countries and depend a lot on trade, that would be disastrous. So really, it was really attacking the banks through the customers. And that's something that we have really been very, very aware of now.
Thank you, Benjamin. Would anyone else like to talk about efforts underway to both secure the public sector and or engagement with industry?
Kirsten, if I can, I mean, I
Yes,
really
please.
like it on this one. So I mean, I think the UK public sector has come a long way. I think, particularly our critical national infrastructure, sectors have really stepped up. We're helping to use our cyber assessment framework to help them assess their own maturity and think about bluntly what the right level of maturity is for different sectors who have different needs, in the same way they do actually in a range of other security issues. But I think we have to be conscious that governments and public sectors face particular risks. In particular, I think from state actor interest, whether that's espionage to find information, or whether that's the potential for other kinds of cyber incidents. And I think, therefore, we certainly expect that our own public sector really takes a leadership role in this and demonstrates what's possible. That's partly why we put a level of protection around them with things like our active cyber defence programme, but it's also actually why the UK government published its government cyber security strategy recently, which is an attempt to sort of demonstrate the kind of resilience we expect. And its two major focus areas are that really basic focus on resilience. So really drumming home that we expect every organisation in the public sector to have prepared itself to be resilient against a reasonable range of threats, and actually to be conscious of the kind of threats they face. So one of the things recently, for example, I did was to talk to suppliers of government, and in particular IT suppliers, who sometimes think of themselves as having the kind of risk associated with an IT company. But actually, if you're a supplier to government, in many ways, you take on the level of risk of the people you supply as well. And we need the people in that supply chain to be really conscious of how their cybersecurity affects the cybersecurity of the organizations that they serve as well. And I think that's been an increasing trend that we've seen over the last year or two, and something we're certainly pushing much harder, for example, in our own procurement processes. Because again, as government, we can set expectations of what good procurement looks like in this space that then actually help to change the market. Because frankly, if we're asking for it, others can ask for it too as well. So I think we're keen to see a level of resilience, but we're also keen to talk about defending as one. In the UK, we don't quite have the model that some organisations do in terms of a sort of single government IT system. We've allowed a real proliferation of different systems over time in order to be able to take advantage of the kind of commodity technology that gives us the ability to buy cutting edge systems. But actually what we want people to do is understand that there's also a level of collective responsibility. Again, that one part of the public sector can introduce risk to another part, and therefore it's really important that people see that collective sense of responsibility and don't simply assume that they're not of as much interest because they're not big service providers or more sophisticated parts of government that have national security concerns. Just because of that doesn't mean you're not an interesting place for an adversary to consider acting. So I think we really are asking for a complete step up in resilience and a different level of awareness. As technology changes, we want to see the UK government really leading the way in making the UK the safest place to live and work online. And that's partly why in the last spending review, the government announced investing 2.6 billion in both cybersecurity, but also legacy IT. And our willingness to kind of take this to a different level and say so publicly.
Thanks very much, Lindy. And I want to just pull out a couple of things that you said. I think Peter and Arne both wanted to respond to this question. You talk about supply chain, and obviously as the digital economy grows and the interdependencies grow, the lines around what is critical and what is not have blurred pretty significantly because of how we're all connected, particularly with the financial infrastructure and communications infrastructure. And very much support what you say, obviously, about government as really using the power of the purse to change behavior. So it's a bit, you can say these are the standards that you should act, but if you're saying you can't work with government unless you do certain things, that starts to really move the needle. In the United States, the government's the largest client customer, certainly, with its investment. And I think globally, it's a really interesting point. So Arne, as I turn to you for this question on public-private engagement, how you're protecting the public sector, if you can talk about supply chain security as well as and that integration and any efforts underway in Germany, because I know that there's been a lot of lines and work streams in this space, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So I try to be very sharp. First, we have a legislation. One had been passed in 2015, the so-called IT Security Law 1.0, where we have giving some standards, minimum standards for the critical infrastructures. We have been doing the same in 2021, where we have enlarged the overall scope. For example, also to the defense industry, also to a special, let's say, of strategic interest for Germany. We are a car nation, so of course, a big car industry is kind of manufacturing sites and so on. So to protect them, especially. And there we are having quite a high level of standards. There we are getting all the reports, where they have been attacked, how they have been attacked, and we can support them. So therefore, we're having a very detailed overall situational picture. And I think this is very important for us, number one. And these are hundreds or thousands of companies which are somehow, let's say, fulfilling their minimum standard of technique. And what is interesting, we as a government, we have a procurement power, of course, but the big change is coming out of the industry. So what we try to do is to discuss with the Daimlers, the BMWs, and so on, Volkswagen, to discuss with them what is the right level of technique, what suppliers has to fulfill on the level of information security, like with the TISAX standard and so on. And this is working quite well, and this is quite a success, I think. Then we're having a public-private partnership started with the so-called Alliance for Cybersecurity. And within the Alliance for Cybersecurity are participating more than 5,500 companies in Germany. And this is also, I understood, the biggest, let's say, cybersecurity organization within Europe with these number of companies. These are small, medium-sized companies, but also bigger ones. And this is creating a kind of network of companies to cooperate and how to deal, how to react on account of successful cyber attack and prevent it also. And last but not least, two areas I like to mention. One is, what we have said is there are lots of digitization programs in the government. And for the first time in 21, we said, okay, we are going to invest 3 billion on the digitization of hospitals. But you can just get money out of the 3 billion as a hospital if you're at a minimum investing 15% of it into the level of information security. And there to state for the first time that information security is a precondition of digitization, and you have to invest a certain kind of amount, otherwise you're not obliged to participate in this kind of government funding. And last but not least, what Benjamin has just said, honestly, when I'm going into, I don't know, to a seller of a smartphone, if I like to get a new smartphone, you cannot see it now. So I will not get any advice how secure it is. So therefore, this for us very important in Germany is that we also, if we want to change the overall market, that the consumer, the end consumer, has the possibility to identify how secure is the product. Because then he can decide if I want to have a more secure product or a less secure product. And therefore, we created the so-called IT security labeling, first time starting with messenger services, which we gave to the, and there, then for the first time, the consumers now can decide how secure it is. And there's much more on the run, for example, for smart TV and all the other devices, what the end consumer can decide. And with this area, we want to increase the level of information security. And I think this is our holistic approach in this area.
Thanks very much, Arne. Peter, did you want to respond to this question? I have another one for you. If I didn't know if you wanted to answer to this one.
I'm mostly supporting the other opinions because we generally think the most important key element of raising the resilience status and preparedness is in the human factor, and in most cases the human failures are the problems. So in our cyber strategy, which is under the renewment process, the key element is raising awareness, also not neglecting technical preparedness. So that's all I can say for now.
I'll follow up on that because I think, we've talked about human behavior, the human factor, as you just said. And there's, a big issue as we look globally on the workforce. And we define what we call a cyber workforce, which is really, looking at how do we fill these positions. I think, I'm of the mindset that cybersecurity is an interdisciplinary issue. And so when we think about how do we bring in diversity of thinking and innovation, going to an earlier point, we've got to be pulling in expertise from many disciplines, psychology, sociology, history, as well as math and science. And really getting that innovation in how we think. Are there any efforts in workforce development as you look at this human piece that you are focused on or that you've seen that you think are being particularly effective as we're really looking to build out this resilience in the human factor?
Yes, we must issue educational materials for general uses and raising the education of the population on the cybersecurity field. And we must build connections with the universities and make new educational programs for cybersecurity talented people and get more in the government area. Sorry.
So the education piece is extremely important, obviously, as we look at workforce and how are we building out the workforce, not just in this moment, and whether we're reskilling or upskilling individuals, but how do we cultivate a workforce with children today? I mean, I'm also of the mindset that when, kids are learning how to read on a technical device, they should be learning cyber hygiene, and it's integrated into how they look. But I would ask each of you, Lindy, Arne, Benjamin, as you look at workforce development and or the education element of this, are there any initiatives or successes that you're seeing or challenges that you'd like to talk about? Arne?
Yeah, sure. So let me try. I'm father of three small children, and everybody says as a digital native, and everybody understands how to deal with it. They have no clue about cybersecurity. They don't know how to behave. And it's the same when small children start to go on the street, they have to learn what does it mean. When is a flashlight red? When is it green, and what does it mean? And it's exactly why we, for the smaller people, that where we intensified, started with the so-called school Bible, school book for how to train the children. The challenge there is, the biggest challenge is the teacher, because they also don't know it either, how to behave in a digital world more securely. So this is something where we are going to train and start educational programs and so on. So the biggest challenge what I see is when I compare it to the technological development within our staff and in the public administration. When I compare it to Google, Facebook, and the other ones, they invest 20% of their working time to new programs to educate their own people. Can you imagine in the public sector that we are saying 20% of our time is for educating the people, our own workforce? This means from Monday to Thursday, we work normally, and on Friday, the BSI, as National Cybersecurity Authority, is closed because everybody has to educate themselves. And this is something I think we have to overcome, and that's why we try to do lots of training on webinars, training exercises, and so on. And very important, have, as Peter, I think, has said, very detailed exchanges directly from BSI, cooperation directly in the industry sector or at science sectors, and then after a certain kind of period of 2 months or so, and then come back to BSI and to bring the new learnings, new thinking into BSI, and to re-educate the staff of BSI, so that we have a much closer exchange. I think you have it the same person in the United States. It's a principle of revolving doors somehow for a certain period of time. That's how we try to move forward.
Thank you. One other, yes, Lindy.
I was going to say that I think the other, the two major workforce concerns I have, if I can, the first is scale and the second is diversity. So in terms of scale, I think there is just a massive challenge of making sure that the education system is generating the kind of scale of workforce that we will need for the digital future that we see. And I think, there's just a real question of the imagination, of the scale of change and how it's, Arne's three kids, will be joined by many others that need to really have thought about this as part of their future. So we're certainly thinking about the kind of STEM skills that you need at 11, for example, in a way that means that you can choose set of professions. I had a fantastically inspiring weekend at our Cyber First Girls competition in Northern Ireland a couple of weeks ago, which is aimed at young teenage girls who haven't yet made the choices in their education system of what to do. So we have a chance to help them imagine the possibility and the excitement of some of the things that they could do both in their education, but also then actually as future possible careers. And it was the most inspiring bunch of people I've hung out with for a long time. And we do that partly because the challenge is not just scale, it is also diversity. If we simply replicate the workforce that we currently have, and I think that's particularly true in the national security side, but it's also true actually in tech in general, we will end up missing the opportunity of half the population. The world of computing was dominated by women very early on, and I'd like to see, frankly, a bit of re-leveling to ensure that it's a bit more equitable as we go forward. And that's not just in terms of gender. We also need to make sure that cybersecurity is reflective of the populations that we have as a whole, in terms of geography, in terms of ethnicity, and I think in terms of sort of attitudes and behaviours. And so I really want to make sure that we don't simply recruit in our own image. We actually think about a much wider set of potential recruits for this industry in the future.
I think that is such a critical element. Diversity is just its diversity of thinking. It's one of the efforts that we've prioritized here at CISA, because it's very much about not just gender and race diversity, it's socioeconomic, cultural background. We're launching a neurodiversity program because, to your earlier point about innovation, if we're truly looking to innovate, we have to think about these problems differently. I'll share a quick anecdote about our United States Agency for International Development. They were building out an Ebola suit for healthcare workers, and they did an audition, and they ended up bringing in a woman who was a wedding dress designer because she understood breathability of fabric and movement and all these elements. And I think it was just a great example of how we've got to be thinking about these problems and these issues differently, and also pulling off of other sectors. And so I think that's a critical piece. Benjamin, did you have your hand raised for this question?
Oh, just something that Arne said, which so for the young people, we've definitely had government-funded programs to look at the SG Cyber Youth Program to reach out to the young, and career mentoring as well for senior cyber people to mentor the young people to help them along the way. But we also know that this is going to be a long game. And in the meantime, we've really spent a lot of time on reskilling, a lot of government funding for reskilling, and every citizen has been given a certain amount of money to go for additional courses. And so that's really, really been helpful. And one of the things, of course, is that to train people up in this, the Cybersecurity Agency has led the way because it's populated by people with backgrounds, not just in computer science and information security or military cyber ops, but also with history degrees, with sociology degrees, and all kinds of backgrounds in the Cybersecurity Agency. So that helps.
It's a wonderful point, because I do think it's about how do we make this field accessible, and how do we help mentor and really guide individuals, and I commend the work that each of you is doing in this space with organizations that are really looking to build young talent and building out our younger workforce. Unfortunately, we're getting close to wrapping up. I do want to ask an important question for this particular group, which is, we've talked about each of your individual efforts and what you're doing, but as was mentioned at the outset, cybersecurity offers a tremendous opportunity for bilateral and multilateral cooperation. And we talked about we're thinking through this international norms and standards. What do you think the priorities for multilateral collaboration and cooperation in cybersecurity should be, or what are the efforts that we should be focusing on in this moment? And Peter, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, I think all cybersecurity elements are very important, and we have a multi-level approach regarding the cooperation. It must tackle the detection, prevention, mitigation, restoration problems, best practices, and we must have regular coordination calls regarding the incidents, and in EU level, ENISA, and the international levels in IBVN. So we must have cooperation groups for information sharing and the better information sharing internationally.
Thank you. Arne.
Sorry for finding the mic so quickly. So very, for me, very, very easy. I think we're having very good information sharing on the technical level, for example, with the CCERT network and all this kind of areas. I think it's working great. I think it is great, for example, that the White House, for example, started the kind of, let's say, discussions regarding ransomware and these kind of different, how to tackle these areas. I think this is also great. And what I love to see is not because cybersecurity is currently on the top of the list of everybody, that everybody starts to create something new, but more or less stay with the existing ones and make them more professionally, gives them the right resources and these kind of areas. And when I look to our friends here, with everybody on the call and even much more, we are cooperating very closely. And I think this has to be intensified with the people who also bring something on the table. Not just getting something, but bring really something on the table. But I think this is very important to have here with like-minded people, nations, a very close cooperation.
Thank you. I think that point about like-minded economic partners and allies is so critical. Benjamin.
the good news for ASEAN is that ASEAN was the first region to adopt the 2015 UNGGE cyber norms. And the ASEAN member states appointed Singapore to take the lead in helping to build out the operationalization of the norms. So we're pretty optimistic about that. We've actually had the ASEAN Singapore Cyber Center of Excellence, which my center also does a lot of work with, to build capacity among the ASEAN nations, and with a lot of help and cooperation with US, with the UK, with Netherlands, and with Japan, and also with Interpol, to really build capacity among the ASEAN member states. So we're really looking forward to more of that cooperation in the years to come.
Thank you. And Lindy, to you on how we should prioritize bilateral, multilateral cooperation when we look at cybersecurity and the work and the efforts of the UK.
Thanks. I mean, I think our national cyber strategy is clear that we not only see international engagement as absolutely a key part of our own cybersecurity, but also actually that we see it as key to our broader foreign policy. So I think it's very much at the heart of it. It's no longer a sort of, a marginalized issue. And for me, the absolute criticality here is thinking about the ethics and values behind this. As technology changes, as democracies, we need to think about the kind of values that we want to see encoded into that technology and make sure that the kind of security we put around that reflects what our citizens expect, the kind of freedom of speech that they want, the kind of ability to operate their lives, to take advantage of opportunities, as well as to feel they can protect themselves adequately. And I think there's something really fundamental about how we do that as democracies going forward.
Thank you so much, because I do think that would be another discussion that would be wonderful, is how we look at ethics and innovation, and how we're prioritizing security and all of these elements, which is so critical as we are focusing on human behavior, but focusing on this innovation on the other piece. And this has been a fantastic discussion, and as I expected, I wish we had a lot more time. Very grateful to each of you for the work, and certainly for your service on this issue, and for how creative and thoughtful and deliberate each of you is in your role. And I think, thinking through, as we've discussed, this importance of human behavior, of technology and innovation, how we secure supply chains and use governments as a real force multiplier for action when it comes to supply chain, and being able to operationalize that with industry. And then importantly, how we're looking across the globe for like-minded partners, like-minded allies, as we're building out cooperation and standards and approaches to how to secure the global economy and create a more resilient infrastructure. So to Arne, to Benjamin, to Peter, and to Lindy, thank you so much. And again, thank you for your service and for this wonderful discussion.